Welcome to our Innovation Secrets webinar. Very happy to have you join us. This is something we've wanted to do for a while.
Yeah.
Fair to say we've been pretty busy over the last 5 years since we started Tastehead, which we'll explain a little bit about at the start. But yeah, we're very pleased that you're joining us. Looking forward to going through all of the topics that we're going to discuss today. First of all, should probably start with some introductions.
Yeah, sounds good.
So I'm Brandt, co-founder and managing director of Tastehead.
Yeah, and I'm Micah. I'm a development director and also co-founder of Tastehead.
For those of you who aren't familiar with Tastehead and what we do, we're a food and beverage development agency. We have two big spectrums. The first one is the size of clients that we work with, from very early startups all the way to the likes of Heinz and kind of challenger brands in between. Second big spectrum is the category of products that we develop.
Huge, across all categories.
Yeah, so snack bars, functional drinks, a lot of the common categories, but pet food has come up a couple of times recently.
Who would have known?
Baby food.
Yeah.
So we really do have a broad sort of range of experience across different categories. In this webinar, we were always keen about, as it's our first one, we want to try and pack it full of as much information as possible that's actually going to be useful. I think looking at the people who have attended today, some of you are in marketing roles, others are in sales roles, others might be in product development. So there's going to be a lot of content that we want to try and cram in, bouncing around from different topics, from product development to marketing, etc. The idea being that if we go through quickly, there'll at least be multiple things for everyone, hopefully. So that's the idea. So we will move quite quickly. The next thing to say, we have it's exciting for us. Yeah, we have an exciting reason as to why we're doing this now. We're actually launching a podcast next week.
We were hoping to, yes.
We will hope to, yes. Let's see. There's still some editing going on, but we're pretty confident that it will be out next week. We're calling it Brand New Taste. Brand because it's all about food and beverage brands. New because it's about innovation as well. And taste because that's what we're most passionate about. And we feel that it really needs to underpin anything that you do in innovation and marketing.
Absolutely. That's why we're Tastehead. That's why we came with the name.
100%.
Yeah.
So it's a podcast for people who work in innovation, whether you are a founder of a startup, a brand manager of a larger business, might be a product developer, you might work in sales and just want to have a bit more insights so that you're armed when you go into your, customer meetings, etc. So hopefully we'll appeal to a wide range of people. We want to empower people with the podcast. A lot of the topics that we're going to touch on today are going to be full episodes in the podcast. So hopefully that will give you an insight as to exactly.
And taste once again.
Yes, don't pardon the pun. and really what I would like to ask you who are joining today live is we really want you to be our first listeners of the podcast next week. We would love you to help us shape the podcast, give us feedback. We're going to try and make it very informative, a little bit entertaining as well, but we need to get the right balance. It'd be great to just get your feedback and hear what you think. And hopefully spread the good word so that we can keep doing content like this for everybody.
Yeah, it's been an enjoyable little journey we've had
so
over the last
far,
few weeks.
Mostly, yes.
Yeah.
With that in mind, because we do want to try and do as much, cram in as much as possible, I think we just dive into the first topic.
Yeah.
So the first one that we started with is around getting your MPD off to a good start. For us, it's so important to get it right at the start, get it set up correctly. Otherwise, the amount of cost and pain of having to backtrack later. And I think that this will be really useful for sort of smaller teams and startups. But in all honesty, we've worked with some bigger companies that we feel they often miss opportunities here. And so we just very quickly going to go through some of the key things that we see sometimes get missed or misunderstood. I've broken it down into 4 main stages. First one is ideation. Second one is strategy. Third one is the brief. And the fourth one is the kickoff phase. There's obviously other aspects that go on. And if you work at a large company, there might be gate stages and so on. But we're just keeping it quite sort of top line, I would say.
And obviously, this is just to get it going. This is literally the start of the process.
Exactly. Yeah. So at the ideation phase, the first thing you want to be honest about is what's the ambition for this MPD? Is it purely because you're launching a new brand, you want to grow your revenue, you want to grow brand awareness, or it could be that if you're already an established brand, you need a range that's a bit more profitable than the one that you launched with. It could be you're doing it for PR purposes. You know, the wasabi chocolate that Lindt did a few years ago, I'm not sure they were ever expecting that to really take off, but it was great PR for them. So that has its place. Could be that you're protecting a key customer relationship. So all these are valid reasons, but depending on what the reason is, might change whether you are going to, how you look at COGS, your shelf life, whether you go with classic flavors or something a bit more niche and adventurous, the timelines, etc. These are all the things that you need to sort of factor in right at the start. So once you've got those identified, you've got to start coming up with ideas.
Yeah, and that's where we use as stimulus a lot of different things. Obviously, everyone will log on, Google stuff, get it off the internet. But we've got loads of books. We've got 1,000 odd books, probably more downstairs. We say to all the chefs, pick up a book, have a look, because there are things there that you wouldn't necessarily have seen directly on the internet.
And it's to jog your memory a lot of the time. It's not about you don't know it and you don't want to feel, I don't need a book because I've got the expertise.
I saw something and you know which book, you don't know exactly what it is. So things like 100%. That. Obviously, there's historical stuff we've done, MPD. You say, I remember doing that and that worked or that didn't work. So that's a really good thing.
Might not have worked for a reason back then, but
it might work this time.
Exactly.
Competitor products, obviously a really good ideation. Again, for both the good and the bad. So it's worth looking at both. We also look at obviously things like trend reports that people do. And any other sort of magazines or anything like that.
And when you've got all of these ideas down, you need to then very quickly eliminate the ones that aren't worth kind of spending much time on. We have a very basic technique where we've got a big wall downstairs and we'll create a very simple axis where left to right, you score, you write all your ideas down onto Post-it notes, and then left to right, you essentially score them. How excited are you about the opportunity? Now that could be based on how it will taste, how much revenue it will do, and it's just your gut feeling. But you basically then place the Post-it notes on a sliding scale left to right based on that axis. And then the vertical axis is how easy is it going to be to launch this? What are the challenges? Is it challenging? And so by doing that, you can very quickly start to see what comes up in the top right hand corner, and that gives you an indication as where you probably want to start. So that's a very basic tool, but one that we often start our sort of ideation workshops with. Next, moving on to the strategy phase, I think a key one is deciding, are you going to use market data? Because sometimes it's useful, sometimes it isn't. I think if you are going to use it, a key thing for us is set action standards right at the start. So essentially saying that if the testing results achieve 80% acceptance on a particular sort of test that you want to do, then we will do A. Otherwise, if it's less than 80%, we will do B or C. I think it's important to have that decided at the start rather than on the fly. The analogy I always like is if you go to a casino, not that I've ever been to a casino, but give yourself a budget at the start rather than when you're sort of in the hole already. So, you know, a little bit of a fun analogy there.
I think something that we often talk about before we start is how much will prototyping play in what we call kitchen testing in just here at Tastehead. Sometimes you need to do it and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you need to almost see if it's a feasible product. So you're not going sort of really deep into it and developing something. You just, can it happen or not? And that depends on the product. Sometimes you do need to do it. Sometimes you don't need to do it.
Yeah. Identifying who the stakeholders of the project are as well. So again, for larger brands, this is kind of obvious, but for smaller teams, things like a RACI document. So those of you who aren't familiar, who's responsible, accountable, who's going to be consulted, and who's going to be informed. I won't go into any more detail there, but that's sort of one of the tools and approaches that you can have that just helps to kind of, give out the responsibilities that they various.
And everyone is clear of what their sort of position is with that.
Exactly. Yeah. Next, we'll have the brief for the project. I often think it can be the root of any unsatisfactory results at the end result. I think this is especially clear with things like branding and design projects, the amount of branding teams that you speak to. And the client, it's very clear their vision in their mind, but they think that gets translated perfectly in a sentence or two, but you've really got to go into the detail and leave no stone unturned, as it was. So having a very clear brief is vital. Having timelines and estimated volumes, even if you're going to be flexible on those, is a very good standard practice just for keeping third parties accountable, especially manufacturers.
Yeah.
If you let them know that, actually we're flexible, we don't have a launch date, etc., you're instantly saying to them, right, these guys are bottom of the pile. So I think for everybody, it's good to have things locked in, even if you don't know what they need to be, but just have something.
And it shows you're serious as well. You've got to have those timelines in, whatever they are, something there.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's something that we in a brief that we find more and more important is what's in and out of scope, and what are the must-haves, rather than what the nice-to-haves. And as we've sort of over the last 5 years, we've come down this more and more and more, both with ourselves but also with our clients, to really hammer that home. And we'll come on to more of that later, I think.
Yeah. So the final stage that we mentioned is the kickoff. I think you need to understand who needs to attend. You need to check people's availability for the whole project at this kickoff, the amount of times that you get ready to present results and, oh, sorry, I'm on holiday. And then when that person's back off holiday, another person is on holiday. So make sure you have that availability check of all the key stakeholders up front, the amount of times where that has caused delays unnecessarily.
And sometimes we've gone ahead and said, right, as long as we can just present to you, then the other person's not there. And then they say, well, it wasn't there and I need to know, and you've just wasted some time, really. Checklists, another one you're passionate about. I am. I mean, partly because I'm old and I forget, but just having that checklist is something that we all do probably in our daily life anyway, but just as part of work, having a consistent checklist for the brief that not just ourselves but development chefs, project manager can all tick through, so we're not missing anything. It's vitally important, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. Do you need to have smaller kickoffs immediately after the big kickoff? So we have a kickoff immediately after a client kickoff with our development team, and that's where we're basically going things through. We have something like a 86-point checklist where we're looking for, are there going to be any challenges on this project with sweetness, acidity, bitterness, trigeminal effects, transit testing, there's all these things, and we want to identify, do we see a challenge on this project? If so, what are the potential solutions? Let's all sort of workshop that now while we've got all heads in the game. Who could help with those challenges? Lean on your supply chain, absolutely, whether it's ingredient suppliers or other third parties, people you know. Think of these at the start, not kind of a few weeks later when you're going into the development kitchen, get the ball rolling early.
And sometimes we find that when we go through that, we actually think, we didn't cover that off in the kickoff. We might go back to the client and say that we missed out these points, or we discovered something, and we'll feed that back and see if they're all right with them. So again, we got to get that brief right. Yeah,
absolutely. And then how do you test all of those potential solutions? Have a strategy. Again, don't go into the kitchen with a load of ingredients and scratch your head and say, right, where do we start? Sit down, take the time. It's vitally important for us, because unlike the product development roles we had before Tasted, where if it takes you 5 days or 7 days or 10 days to develop something as an in-house development team, doesn't make a huge difference. For us, the difference is profit or loss potentially with what we do. So we've actually had to become very efficient. We've still got to deliver an amazing result. We can't cut any corners. So we've got to work very efficiently. And so hopefully, I think in the podcast, I think we'll have a few areas within that people will find helpful.
So that was quite a big one, wasn't it, really? Because it's so important getting that off to a good start, that project. Next thing we quickly wanted to cover was how to taste in the innovation process. So, or
just in general, to be honest.
Yeah, well, for me, it's throughout my day.
And it sounds a bit patronizing, like how to taste, but it's just so many people don't have the training.
Exactly.
Need the training, and as we're going to go into.
Exactly. So, I mean, and it does sound like, well, why we focus on it, but you're only really going to get repeat purchase on food and drink products if they taste good. People will often buy something for the first time, like look at it, like the sound of it, like the brand. But if it tastes bad, they're not going to go for it again. So, and like you said, most people don't have any sort of formal training, but they might have to sign off recipes. They might have to sell into customers and so forth. So, it's something that we feel is really important to teach to people who are not necessarily usually trained. Also, another thing is that we don't like to rely on focus groups too much, partly because they're not trained, and there's often sort of confusion between things like bitterness versus stringency versus acidity.
They'll say one thing, but actually they mean something else.
Exactly, because they haven't had that training.
Yeah.
One thing that is actually really relevant, because a couple of days ago, David Gluckman, who's a marketeer, he's been developing brands for 50+ years. He wrote a very good book. He said about Course and Press, which is another brand that I work on. But it was relevant about taste, because these products are superb. They taste like they're created by experts rather than dumbed down by consumers. And I think that was a good sort of thing to say. You know, experts are appreciated in other areas, but taste is something they're not always done. So a classic example was in the early 1884 when Coke brought out New Coke. Spent $4 million, which when $4 million was $4 million, and they had to go back to the old Coke. So, and that was through consumer testing, they did that. So really relevant, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. A big part of the how to taste that we find is very useful to teach people about or make them aware of is the whole taste versus flavor. We did a social media post recently, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but taste is detected on the tongue: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami. Everything else, flavor, is aroma detected in the nasal cavity. And the reason it's so important to understand that is people will often think that to make something taste better, just go in with more flavorings or more of the same flavorings or throw in some more herbs or spices. It's getting the balance of the sweetness and the acidity to the correct amount with whatever fruit or other flavor is going in there. That's what makes it moreish. That's what makes your mouth water. That's what makes it delicious. And for us, the amount of times we taste the product where they're probably using good quality ingredients, it's been manufactured well, but it's the balance of the ingredients that really holding it back. Yeah, it's
I bore
if I had a
people
penny,
to tears.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've just seen it in my chefing career, the amount of people who will just over focus on flavor. And I would argue that for the moorishness, the deliciousness of food and drink, I think taste is arguably more important.
Yeah, I'd agree. Before we go into tasting, we need a plan. So it depends what you're doing this tasting for. It might be a new bit of MPD, it might be EPD, it might be benchmarking against competitive products. They all need slightly different approaches depending on what they are. So we might be looking, for instance, if we're doing our products that we are just existing product development or even some sort of quality assessment, might be looking at floors, for instance.
Yes.
But if we're looking at something else like product development, you'll be looking maybe at what makes it taste better. You're just looking at different stages and how we can do exactly what you say, better balance.
Yeah, and it's different for every product. So if you're doing biscuits, then you're looking for the Maillard reaction. You're looking to see if the raising agent levels are the correct amount, because everyone wants potentially, if it's it Viennese or something, you want it to be light and fluffy, but you don't want to be tasting that soapiness or the metallic notes or whatever. And the big thing for me on this is list all of these things out at the start, because how often do you hear people say, I'm just letting you know I'm not very good at tasting? It's usually nonsense. Usually people are more than capable of detecting things, but they don't have a plan. And for me, if you start to identify these things and list them out, then you go in and you find, right, how do I score that? How do I score this? And people's confidence just grows.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So where are we at? So scoring each attribute individually as well. Do they need to be weighted? That's another sort of key element of when you're doing a tasting. Even setting up the tasting room or session.
That's so important.
Yeah. No strong aftershaves or perfumes. Preferably in life in general, if I'm honest, but certainly not before a tasting session. You love it when someone comes in with a hot mug of coffee into a tasting
all the time,
session,
and I'm like, well, it's about to taste something, all you can taste is coffee.
Exactly.
And you've had something hot in your mouth, so you change the way you tasted. So
and that applies to noises and so on. Make sure that your senses are there to assess the products. Mornings are best where possible, not always possible, not immediately after brushing your teeth or your breakfast, but before lunch is our sort of, I think that's been proven to be the time of day where your palate's the most sensitive.
It's
That's
keen,
a good,
isn't it?
good
Yeah.
start. Yeah. The order in which you taste samples is really important as well. It should be fairly obvious that you would do savoury to sweet, or if you're going, the flavor intensity is increasing, start with the lighter ones, etc. You might have, I know we talked about taste and flavor, but you also have things like trigeminal effects, which is the burn of chili or the heat of ginger or the cooling of mint. Save those ones till right at the end, or potentially for another tasting session. And even if you have those in or not, come back and try things in an opposite order at different times of the day. Sometimes if you're really fine tuning, you want to come back at multiple times. And then the big question is, do you need to take, if you're coming close to signing off the recipe, do you need to take a full portion home with you and have it in a real world environment? Because having all of your attributes that you want to score and in a sort of tasting session environment and just having, a small bite, it's not how people enjoy products.
It might be too rich, or if you've got something with some heat, some ginger, like a small bit, hardly anything. But as you've drunk a bottle or a can, it's going to really hit home. Systematic approach when you're tasting is so important. So I started in the wine industry, that, and we were taught it. So we've been working on, one of the products we're working on is Wednesday's Domain, which is a non-alcoholic wine, and so we had to do this with that, proper glassware, stemware, but it's all about 4 points. So appearance, you look at the product. This is not only for drinks, but it's for foods as well. Yeah. You look at the rim, you look at the color. Have you got the right sort of color? What's it telling you about that drink in this case? And then it's the aroma. Now, I was always taught in wine is that by the appearance and the aroma, you should be able to tell grape variety, the maturity, the origin, lots of different things. And taste is just there really to confirm some of these. But we need to obviously taste, because you do get different sort of aromas and flavors, which are the same sort of things when you're tasting, whether it's nose or whether it's in the mouth. And then with a lot of things, less so with wine and drinks, but you will get texture there, because you'll get weight in the mouth, whether it's alcohol or sugar. And then with other foods, like I said, biscuits before, it's about the texture, how it crumbles, how hard it is, or tender.
But so have that systematic approach.
Always
identify the things that you want to score beforehand. Really hope that this will give people more confidence going into tasting sessions, because as we've said, often people signing off recipes or making the decision don't have the training. So I think the podcast episode that we do on this hopefully is going to be really useful to people.
And we'll touch on, sometimes you need to do blind tastings. So if you're doing you're comparing a new recipe to an old recipe, something like a triangle test where you have two recipes, but you have two samples of one and one of the other, and you've got to find the odd one out. And that is a very important way, because we all, if we know what we're tasting, whatever it is, if we know what it is, we will often make judgments on that, whether it's ourselves, our clients, whoever. So having these blind tastings can be really important.
100%. Okay, so on to the next topic, choosing the best flavors. So you've decided that you're going to launch a new range of something. It could be for a new brand or an existing brand. How do you choose which flavors to go for?
I mean, there's so many factors. A lot of it is, what is the ambition for that product? You've got to look at your target market. So really understand what they want, so you're providing the right thing. Have a look at the category. What sells best in that category? Whether it's, in ice cream, it's vanilla is by far the biggest seller, or if it's chocolate, it's milk chocolate. So you've got to look at that. Look at what the competitive set is. So that's obviously part to do with the category, but they may have gone down certain trends and things are changing, and see where you might be going with some MPD. And one that we always talk about is, you may have trends on certain things, but you've got to have the right flavor, the right ingredients for the right base. So for instance, in a dairy product, something like caramel would work, but citrus probably wouldn't work. So even though citrus might be a good trend, it wouldn't work in that product. So you've got to understand what you're actually making, what that product is.
Yeah, absolutely. And the amount of startups we get to come to us and they go for matcha, pomegranate, and rosemary or something, and we're sort of like, whoa. Now, if you're launching into quite a saturated category and you don't have any USPs around health claims or sustainability or what else, you're just trying to do a great tasting product, then yes, you probably need to go a bit more niche for your flavors so that you will just be considered by the buyer, because they look at their existing products and say, well, we already have 4 products that have a chocolate flavor, so why would I list yours if you're not bringing anything new? But that's quite rare. Most people innovating, especially nowadays, there's some form of functionality, there's some USP coming in, and if that's the case, then you really want to be, in our opinion, looking at what sells best, because you've only got to look at the most categories and the big sellers. Ice cream is a classic one. When we were developing the ice cream, obviously you before me, but the ice cream at Green and Blacks, and so between us probably developed 20 ice cream products. But vanilla, what percentage of the sales was from vanilla?
Well, at the time it was 50%,
50-60%, yeah, and it's
by far the biggest.
I suppose in the ice cream category, vanilla, chocolate, and maybe strawberry is probably 90% of the sales, or 80% or something. And that doesn't really change over time, and so you might hear a lot of buzz about these sort of trends and niche flavor combinations, and sometimes it might be the right reason, but try and start at what's got the most breadth, what are people actually going to buy, what will they understand, and then focus on getting it tasting as good as possible. Where can you have other USPs around health or other aspects?
Well, it might be a twist to the recipe, so it's vanilla with a twist or chocolate with a twist, that people can understand it.
Now, having said that, there are times where there's some surprises. There's a really good example that we've got right here that I have to give you all the credit for.
Thank you. So Course and Press. I also work at Course and Press. We brought out sparkling rhubarb a few years ago. There were no rhubarbs on the market in sparkling drinks, but it fit the brand, and everyone loves it. It's our biggest selling product, the sparkling rhubarb.
And it would have been difficult to find some data that would tell you rhubarb would be the best selling.
Exactly.
But I think it was also, there were some pragmatic reasons behind it as well, because you basically got as many juice samples as you possibly could into the development kitchen, and you were tasting things and figuring out what works, what didn't work, and this one just happened to taste really good, which isn't, I don't think, immediately obvious to consumers maybe, but it's another example of, if you think something tastes great. I think the design of the can is lovely. I think the colors of the sort of the pinks
jumps
and reds
off the shelf, doesn't it?
Exactly. So I think that is the packaging and the branding doing its piece, and then the taste does it.
Exactly.
And no one would have told you rhubarb would be your best seller, but it is.
But so that was good. But one didn't work so well. So it was on the same sort of thing. So kitchen garden flavor, nostalgic, gooseberry. We launched a gooseberry a few years back, and it didn't really sell. Now I think I gather what the reason was that a lot of people don't know what the taste of gooseberry is. Those that did know it, like myself, loved it, but so many people didn't. So you would have thought similar, but a lot of people know what the taste of rhubarb is, so their expectations are fulfilled, whereas gooseberry different. So that's where it goes a bit too niche. So you've got to bear that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are also, we talked about, or we will talk about more so in the podcast, but good and bad flavors. So when I talk about that, it's about what is the best, down to what really doesn't perform as well, and this is where things like the flavorings you have. So top right at the top, you got the extracts, things like, I'll use vanilla as a good example because we all know it through things like ice cream and so forth. So your extracts are best 100% from vanilla, and then you go down to what are called FTNF, from the name fruit, and that's where at least 95% of it comes from the vanilla pod, and
that will still be declared as natural vanilla
flavoring, as opposed to vanilla extract. And then down from that is just a natural flavoring with less than 95% of the fruit in it, and that is just natural flavoring. And then not many people use it so much now, but then under that you get artificial flavoring,
which is vanilla essence
or vanillin, which is one of the molecules in vanilla, but it's just one of them.
I always like this one because people get confused between, especially with vanilla, extract, flavoring, essence, because essence sounds quite nice, but there you go, that's just
the lowest thing.
Exactly.
And then the last thing I think is sometimes people want to always add flavors, more flavor, but sometimes do you need to? We talked about biscuits earlier and the mild reaction. That's a good example. Sometimes that lovely caramelized biscuity note that you get from the right level of baking, the flour and the butter and
you
the
don't
sugar.
want to ruin that with loads of vanilla. Let that be the flavor,
or another flavor, orange or whatever. Just sometimes when you've really got that flavor nails, just let that
and often you see with so many brands, the original is the best seller. I mean, with Green and Blacks, dark 70% by far the best seller, dark 85 is second, then the milk chocolate, and it's not until usually the 4th, 5th, 6th SKU where you start seeing some of the flavorings coming in, and they really do make up a small amount of the sales. Okay, we've got a little bit of time to make up, and that's good because we're coming on to our quick fire round, which is going to be the kind of nailing your recipe. So we're just going to blast through these, and these are our main bugbears and learnings in terms of if you're in a role where you're developing the products in a test kitchen, a development kitchen. These are the things where we just see them get missed or so on. So let's fire through. Okay, so the first one, grams. Please do your recipes in grams. We had something come through the other day, and it was but it was like 263 grams of something. It was half a pinch of something else. So we're trying to guess. So please, grams. It just
a tablespoon of this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But even milliliters, because volumetric, you just can't get the accuracy. So grams every
grams.
time.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of things when you're cooking them or when they're soaking stuff up, evaporative loss or absorption, really important.
Yeah,
I'll leave it at that for the moment. But
well, no, I think I'd like to expand on that because this comes up a lot.
Yeah.
If you put, let's say, a 500 gram batch of cake in the oven, you're not getting 500 grams out. So why do your nutritionals say that it's 500 grams? And also, let's say you've lost 10% evaporative loss, doesn't mean all the ingredients have come down by 10%. No. You've only lost the liquids. And even within the liquids, some of them release more water than others. So it can get very technical, but the amount of development that happens with HFSS in mind or certain claims, if you don't factor in the evaporative loss, you might not have the correct results.
Absolutely.
Specific gravity. This is another one that comes up. People often aren't familiar with. It's a very useful tool where if you want to understand the volume to weight ratio of something, let's say that you're developing a mousse recipe. If you're in the development kitchen, do a specific gravity test. There'll be something online about this, I imagine, but it's essentially having a volumetric container, filling it with water, seeing what that weight is, emptying it, filling it with your recipe, leveling it off, understanding what the rate is, and then the ratio will tell you how much you've whipped up.
Grams per litre, isn't it? Yeah.
And it's a good way of saying, do you need to whip it more or not? Because saying that it took you 3 minutes on your KitchenAid on speed 6 is not very useful for a factory.
No.
So having something like a specific gravity number, you can give it to the factory and they should be able to replicate the results. That's another key one.
Yeah, I agree. Record all your results and not just the ones that work well, ones that don't work well. They're almost
not that
important.
we ever have ones that don't work.
We never have like version 98 or something like that. So yeah, really important, and why it didn't work in the notes, and make sure that is clear so you can put on to the next.
Because when you get to version 98, you've gone around the houses and like, we tried that, didn't we, a few months ago? Why didn't it work again? Should we look at it in a bit different way? Record all your results, even the failures. Have the brief built into your recipe sheet. Some of the projects we work on now, we're looking at the grams of fat per 100 calories. We're looking at a source of protein claim. There's so many aspects that we're making sure we want to hit. It is easy to forget one of them and make some changes that achieve the result in another. So make sure you've got all of your targets in the recipe development sheet, just to make sure that you never miss anything and have to do it again. That's a key one.
Yeah. One thing that we often do, especially at the start, is quick tests. We're doing a batch of something, let's say. We'll do like enough for like 5 batches, and then we won't like specify that we need to do it at this temperature or that temperature or certain sort of things. It's about like testing different ingredients, let's say, and that way you can quickly test whether something works or doesn't work, and then you can be more specific later. It gets questions answered quickly.
Don't feel that you need to do 10 full batches of something. You can sometimes get 80% of the way there with some quick tests. Good point. I like to taste in a different room sometimes, because I remember at Green and Blacks we had a delivery of vanilla extract, and the box had broken. There's vanilla everywhere, and I was like, I'll put it to the corner of the room. And I was developing a recipe. I was up in the vanilla in this recipe, and I couldn't taste any difference. I was thinking, what's
all around you?
Went to the office, scratched my head, came back, opened the door, and just the vanilla. So go to a different room from where you're doing the work to taste the samples, because you might detect things.
Which is the same, as you said earlier, about not having perfume or anything like that in the room. It's the same sort of concept. You know. The other thing we talked about, grams, do that, but make sure it's in percentages, because it's easier to understand once it's in percentages. Once you've weighed stuff in grams or whatever, get those percentages. They're easy to understand. Where, you know, let's say you're doing a flavoring and it's in at 0.3%, you then know, well, I can up it by 20%, as in 20% of 0.3, and then you get you know what that percentage is, and it's easier to work in the mind as well.
Yeah, and just to be clear, what we're saying is it's fine to be doing a 725 gram batch of something, but when you're making changes to the recipes, bring that back to 100%.
Correct.
Easier to make changes.
Yeah.
What else do we have? Record every detail about every ingredient. So the supplier, the batch, if it's relevant, exactly what it is, because flour from one supplier isn't necessarily the same as another flour supplier, and this applies to quite a few ingredients. You want to, in product development, be sure that any changes that you're not expecting you want to be able to identify where the issue is, and you don't want it to be, well, is it potentially that we used a different supplier of paprika? Like, did someone top up the tub and not change the supplier changed? So all of your ingredients be as specific and detailed as you can.
There's a few things like granulated white sugar which won't change.
Sure.
But most of them do.
Yeah. Agreed.
When you're actually developing it, mixing order can be as important as some of the things like the actual recipe. You want to put the dries in together, disperse the small amounts of dries in the larger amounts so they don't clump, and always sieve if you've got dry ingredients, stuff like that, otherwise you'll get these clumping. Just simple things like that.
100%. It gets missed more than you would probably expect. Label everything, and if you've got pots of things, don't label the lids. How many times 5 pots open the lids, they all get, which one was it again? So label things, be very clear. Everything needs its own version number. There's a temptation, we'll call this one version 22A, and then you get to version 22G, and it gets a bit confusing. Try and give everything a new version number.
We always record the pH and the water activity. pH is so important for the processing and the shelf life. Usually you need a certain acidity to make it work in the factory. The water activity is obviously very important when it comes to the longevity of it, the shelf life of it, depending on what you're doing, especially if you're an ambient product, that hasn't been processed in a retort or pasteurized in a can or something. You need to keep that water activity low. And the reason it's good to always test it, whether you think you need it or not, is you don't know if you might need it, because it can help you identify if there was a difference with the recipe with an ingredient. Things like pH can affect things like the setting setting agents like pectin and so on. Gels and so forth.
So you need it for more reasons than you might think. Finally, take photos, record videos of processes as well. The amount of times where, because we videoed the mix, we didn't then have to go back and do it again when the factory asked, what did it look like at this stage? So try, and it's so easy now with your phones.
Or earlier on, when we didn't do it and we had to remake the stuff.
Exactly.
That's why we do it now.
That's the lesson learned. Yeah. Great. Okay. Next topic, HFSS. And who knows what's going to happen with HFSS? It's a little bit up in the air. I wouldn't be surprised if it changes or evolves. I think regardless, you can kind of apply some of these tips to just developing healthier topics, healthier products, which is a trend that is here to stay. It's the one that we're just seeing a real continuous growth in terms of people. They're expecting more and more from their food and beverage products around functionality, health, a real focus on that. I'm not going to go into all the details as to how to score HFSS. I'll do a very quick crash course. Essentially, you've got your A points, which are your energy, your saturated fats, your sugar, and your sodium, which you can also link to salt as long as you do the calculation. They're your bad points. You've then got your good points, which are fiber and fruit, nuts, and vegetables. I forget off the top of my head if there's another one. The other kind of good point you have is protein, but where it gets a bit confusing is if your A points are fewer than 11, then you can use your C points, your good points, to subtract your score, and that's when you need to be getting down. That's what allows you to get down to 3, which is the non-HFSS target that you want to be achieving, because if they're lower than 11, you're able to include the protein points within that as well. So it's, as most of you know, it is. Hence why I'm struggling to just explain it in a few seconds. Have a look online. But there's 4 or 5 sort of key tips that we just want to share. We've worked on a few HFSS projects now. We've got a couple that are still active, and we do have some good learnings. One of them, saturated fats, are the ones you really want to avoid, because you're getting a double hit on those, because they are very high in energy, and they're, funny enough, high in saturated fats. So anything you can do to swap saturated fats for non-sat fats. There's lots of products that technical ingredient suppliers have now, certain tapioca starches and so on, that can help with some of these things. So I think the supply chain has really jumped on this in terms of having products that can help. So certainly reach out to them. A big one for me is the sugar and the salt that you add to a recipe. Think about the availability of it to your palate. We all know that seasoning your pasta water and so on is a really good idea. And yeah, sure, if you're cooking at home and you don't have a focus on these sort of HFSS, then absolutely. But you don't want to have salt or sugar content in a recipe that's absorbed into something, locked in there. And how much of it do you not actually bite into when you're chewing something? So let's say you're doing a snack bar, for instance. If you blend it all together, then the small amount of salt and sugar that you have got is kind of just getting mixed in with a lot of savory compounds. If, however, you keep snack bar to have larger chunks of things, then you get the ability to put the salt and the sweetness into the syrup that binds it. So when you have your bite, you get a nice hit of seasoning and or sugar, and then you chew into the sort of savory nuts or whatever it might be, and guess what, it actually makes you want more of that sweetness, and you get that on the initial hit. So thinking about how you put your salt and your sugar into the recipe, I think is a good analogy of this
is with chips.
So
you should always put fine salt on chips and not flaky salt, because the flaky salt falls off and you're not getting that salt hit. And that's just a very simple way of saying use the correct salt or sugar and deliver it in the right way.
Fiber is usually easier to add than protein, tends to be a bit cheaper as well. So if you're trying to up your C points or other ingredients that can bring down your A points, you've got obviously the chicory root fiber syrup that goes in an increasing amount of products, not just ours, but everybody in the industry. Obviously your inulin powder as well. There's other ways that you can swap certain ingredients out that with the ones that have a bit more fiber. You've got things like flaxseed, you can get milled. It's funny how many of these you can actually sneak into products when you need to, and it might just be that extra point in fiber is enough to make a big difference to your HFSS score as well. You get double points for if your fruits or vegetables are dried, so that can be an opportunity. Things like freeze-dried raspberry powder, yes, they're a bit expensive, but they also taste great because you've got the acidity there, going back to what we're saying about the right flavor for the right product. So looking at fruit powders can be useful there. And then the final thing is enter the nutritional information of all ingredients. Raising agents have a significant amount of sodium. Don't think, was only in at 0.3%. I'll just find out what the nutritionals are at the end. Get the nutrition information for all of your ingredients at the start.
That's a really good tip. Well, we've only got 15 minutes left, so let's crack on.
Okay.
One thing we always say to our clients is don't overstretch with your claims and USPs. And what I mean by that is that when you've got all these tick boxes that you want, high protein, low sugar, high fiber, etc., each one will often compromise on taste to a certain degree. You might get effects on cost, on shelf life, or any other key factors. So you want a USP or two, but you don't need the whole list of them, because people are looking for one or two usually. And something that we always say is that, let's separate between the must-haves and the nice-to-haves. The must-haves, you probably have, 2 or 3. Nice-to-haves, often people say that's a must-have. And you say, well, if we do that, we might not be able to get this taste right or do something else correctly. And we say, I'd really like it to happen, but it's not an absolute must. Okay, let's put in the nice haves. It doesn't mean we're not going to aim for it and strive for it, but it goes back to the brief, and getting that correct at the start is so important. And
having a hierarchy for those things is quite important as well. It's happened a number of times where, understandably, people say, I don't want any artificial preservatives. If there's a real challenge on shelf life, you've got to be really honest about that. We've had a couple of projects where adamant at the start, and then it was just obvious you're not going to achieve either what the category needs you to or whatever. And they have then said, okay, let's put it in, because actually a lot of these things, no one wants to put them in, but they are more widely expected than some people think. And if it is the difference of being able to launch products or not, a lot of people will do that. But But be honest about that at the start if you can, because you don't want to waste time and resources, going down the wrong routes. We've seen the amount of brands that launch and then almost immediately start compromising on any sort of claims that they make. We've got a project at the moment where it's only launched sort of a few months ago, and already from initial feedback, some of the things that the client was adamant about at the start, what they're realizing is when it comes to balancing against taste and product performance, most people are happy for it to not have a certain sugar claim or what have you.
Calorie.
I think it just happens a lot. You very rarely see people launch and then try to improve their claims. It usually, in our experience, tends to be people relax them to have a better tasting product based on the feedback of consumers. We had a good example of a project recently where we thought it was quite good in terms of the balance of claims and taste.
So I'm just reached back behind. So it's one from Stratford Sodas that we worked on. These, all they wanted really was a really great tasting mixer for rum. And what can we use? We just make sure it's good quality, tastes good, and there was nothing on sugar levels. I mean, we wanted to keep it under the sugar levy,
of course,
obviously, and we sort of suggested that for commercial reasons, but really they just wanted a great tasting mixer with rum, and it was just quite a joy to work on, wasn't it? Because of that reason.
Yeah, because it's not, let's try and put fiber in. It's focused on the taste, and in our experience, that's what matters most.
Yeah, exactly.
And even if you have these claims, because sometimes it's great if you do have these fiber claims or calories or sugar, absolutely. Doesn't mean you want to splash them on the front of pack. It's not a brand that we worked on, but an example I always use is Beautiful, the kefir brand. Now, when they started, there was some kefir around, but it was very much similar to kombucha at the time, where it was seen as a bit of a very much health product. Some kombuchas have very hippie style branding, etc. You see it in Whole Foods. It didn't feel particularly aspirational. Beautiful came out, this really sleek white packaging, very minimalist, dialed up taste. Yes, it had 40 different types of probiotic strains in there and this, that, and the other, but they didn't go big with it on the front. And you just see the success that they've had, because even with health products, people want them to be aspirational. They want them to be tasty. And the louder you go with these health claims, you're running the risk of the perception of the consumer being, it's probably very good for me, but might not be that tasty. Because often that is the case. And, even with these, I mean, how many brands have real success by just saying, well, we're 30% less than or something like Hippies, which, is chickpeas. I don't even know the nutritional profiles. I don't make any claims about it, but people think, chickpeas must be a bit better for me. I imagine that's a good reason why they've had success. And they taste great as well. Yeah, absolutely. So balancing those, I
mean, I think, when you've got, great tasting product, great branding is really important, obviously. But 1 or 2 USPs is probably enough. And you may have other ones as well, but actually shouting about all of them on pack is really difficult, I think, because you get a really confused, front of pack and all that. So even if you've got more, just focus on 1 or 2 of them. What makes it different to your competitors?
Yeah, absolutely. And the final point, organic. You've got to have a good justification if you're going to go down the organic route. Certainly with startups, coming from working on an organic brand and seeing the headaches when there's an issue with the supply chain, because you've got all of your cherries, and then when you need them and you want a particular variety, and then you want that variety to be organic. And then there's that classic case of the cherry bar that with people, it was a loved product, but when there was an issue with supply chain, sadly, it was delisted and there was no other supplies available. So.
And the other thing I'd say about organic is that it was much bigger 10, 20 years ago. And now things like sustainability and fair trade, I think, have overtaken a bit. Doesn't mean that organic's still a good thing, but we get it a lot, don't we? I'd like it to be organic. We're like, it's about getting good ingredients, and organics are nice to have often.
Yeah.
Makes things different.
Okay, so only a few minutes to go. I'm going to rattle through the final 2 topics, and then we'll see if we can get a couple of questions. I think most of the questions we'll just have to answer directly with people, but very happy to do that. I'd like to go talk about how to work with co-manufacturers. Again, probably more relevant for startups, but I think a lot of established brands looking to outsource to co-manufacturers might benefit for this. I've got a big shout out to Harry Turpin of the Savorists. We worked with Harry on the Savorists, the early phases of their product development. He already came to us with a recipe, and we just worked with him to get the best out of it that we could, doing very well. Has a podcast himself, Untold, I believe it is. So please go and check that out. Yep. But yeah, Harry, it's fair to say he had some challenges with manufacturing early on that we helped him work through. And so I got in touch with him, and we already had some of our things, but I'm just going to list off some of the key things that some are from us, some are from Harry. These are the key things to keep in mind. Treat your manufacturer like your first investor, especially if you're a startup. Yes, you want to sort of keep them accountable, etc., but understand that there's not much in it for them at the start, and you're a bit of a headache for them. You know, sorry, but it's true in terms of lots of questions, helping get started for very small volumes initially. So just be mindful of that. We've seen manufacturers just stop responding to people who go all guns blazing saying you should be doing this. Like, you've got to be pragmatic, I think, but still keep them accountable. Don't be a pushover. I think have volumes and forecasting, even if you're not sure. Again, going back to that piece about keeping people accountable. I think you want to engage with them as early as possible. This is one that Harry said. It's one of the first things we do in a project. Even when we don't have a concept, it's often difficult, but we want to know what their capabilities are. We don't want to develop a recipe to find out that their mixes are slightly different and we could have developed it differently. So engage as quickly as you can, but carefully, sort of thoughtfully. Take the time to consolidate all of your questions and requests into a single email wherever possible. They're so busy with day-to-day production. You know, we go quite big at Tasted on the whole customer service. We've got our business development manager. We've got a project team of 2 people. Factories don't tend to have that. You're usually speaking to the owner or the production manager. Very busy people.
Keep on firing questions at them all the time.
Exactly.
One email.
Try and have your product development team attend the trial or be heavily involved. This is one of the things that at the start, when we work with clients, we were very relaxed, saying, look, we're developing products. We'd love to be there at the trial. If you've got budget for that, great. If not, don't worry about it too much. However, we're becoming more and more saying, let's be honest, if you want us to develop the product, you need to sort of assure us we're going to be there at the factory trial phase, because the amount of times there's issues in the factory, it's nothing wrong with the recipe, but the manufacturer just thinks, oh, we don't have that particular tapioca starch, but we've got this one. Don't even need to tell anyone. We'll just use that. If the product development team attend the trial, first thing you do is you taste all the raw materials.
All the raw materials, first thing you do. Yeah.
And it's just one of the most important things.
And then the made up product at different stages, whether it's a raw dough or whether it's a drink before pasteurization, so important. Yeah.
And I think even with the product development team being there, it's fair to say, in some cases, expect a little bit more development time. We had a project we worked on recently. There was only 3 ingredients in it. It wasn't anything particularly challenging about it. And just in the factory trial phase, getting it right took a long time, trial and error. It was just one of those, and it does happen. So just be prepared with that. Final topic, we're going to have to make it another quick fire: sugar versus sweeteners. We're going to do an episode on the podcast with this. Comes up a lot. I just wanted to fire out a couple of insights that we've got. We've done a few research surveys and focus groups on this. In our experience, vast majority of people want reduced sugar. When they get to that point, whether the sweetness then comes from refined sugar or stevia or erythritol or some other natural sweetener, there's not much difference in it. I think there's a perception that refined sugar is the enemy and should be avoided at all costs. But as you say, it's the gold standard sweetening agent.
Yeah, it's because it's sweet, but it has no other flavor. As I always say, is that you don't go into a Michelin star restaurant and see them using sweeteners. They use sugar because that's what it is, or sometimes other natural things, but essentially sugar is the one.
And these sweeteners are getting better. You know, the ones we tend to use a lot of: erythritol, sorbitol, stevia. There's a lot of others that don't work, etc. But just only use them if you really need to. And I think there's a lot of brands that don't need to. I think that to get a better result, happier consumers without having to go down that route.
Exactly.
Do you want to quickly rattle off the couple of bits that you've got there?
Yeah, just that you know, it's not just about the sweetness of these other sweetness, but you've got to look at the text of the humectant. So is it taking available water out? And bulking it, the bulking nature of something like sugar versus a sweetener, shelf life. What sort of shelf life does it give it? The grade, the particle size of some of these things can make a lot of difference. So if we're talking about sugar as opposed to a sweetener, the difference between icing sugar versus caster versus granulated make a huge difference to the texture and taste. Like if you have icing sugar, it has that really immediate sweetness. It's just like that. I don't know what the word is for it, but it's like that.
Well, yeah, but you did a brilliant facial expression, so you didn't even
too sweet, exactly. So I think there's so much to talk about this, but we're right at the end, so we've got to wrap it up quite quickly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So hope a lot of that was useful, informative. We will go through a couple of the questions very quickly. So Sarah has asked, what was your most challenging project and why?
Well, I sort of think it was one of the many non-meat, the vegan
the plant-based alternatives.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think a lot of questions can be answered with that, because it's finding something that tastes good. It's something that has the right texture, and it is like this replacement. We've worked on seafood, fish, meat, all sorts of recipes. Some of the things are the same, some things are different and tricky, but
it is, but rewarding when you get there. Yeah, I mean, some of the learnings, the big question we get is, does methyl cellulose need to be in the product? And just for those of you who are innovating, our answer to that is, if you want to get that sort of rubbery sort of bounce, that texture, that bite of meat, of a sausage, of a chicken nugget or so on, then more often than not, yes. You've got things like konjac, and there's some better versions of that are coming through, but methyl cellulose is so the winner, sort of powerful. And I think we've seen a lot of innovation where people focus on gums and starches and so on, and they don't really replicate it. Things like pearl barley, and there's certain other sort of whole foods that there's some clever tricks there. We obviously can't reveal all of our secrets, but there's some thoughts on that. But I'd agree that's been one of the most sort of challenging ones.
And for you, what would you be most proud of as something we've developed for someone? What do you think?
Yeah, that was the next question we had in. So it was another plant-based alternative. So the vegan pig pork scratchings. So it was in the early days of Tasted, where I still was in the kitchen with my sleeves rolled up.
Both in the kitchen,
and so I focused on the recipe development of this, and it was one of those where it was a real head scratcher at the start. Didn't know where we were going to end up, and when we got to the final recipe, it was what I call true innovation, and it was a recipe that hadn't been done before. It had quite a sort of innovative combination of ingredients and process as well, and people just loved the taste of it. Now, I will say, people who love pork scratching love the taste of it. It is still very salty, very greasy, etc. But we focused on getting that dual texture of the pork scratchings, of that crispiness, but also that sort of succulent fat that you get in the scratching. Exactly. But sadly, I mean, we're waiting to see these boys back on sale, because that was just before COVID, and their main ingredients were coming out of China. They couldn't get the ingredients. They were about to launch into the pub trade. I know, and they had such a good launch. They had Piers Morgan holding up a pack, ranting about it on TV, etc. And I still keep in touch with Sean and Josh, and they do have plans to come back big and strong. So, but yeah, it just goes to show that you do whatever you can in the product development phase, have the best product, but there's other factors as well. Right, we've got 2 minutes. So the other thing, so we've got a question here about where do you think the plant-based trend is heading? And it might be good to just give a couple of minutes of thoughts on trends in general. I think with plant-based, people are seeing it starting to evolve, especially in recent weeks. You've got some retailer-owned labels starting to pull lines. So we're seeing potentially a slowdown. I know you've got some of the big burger brands that are potentially starting to see some slowdown. I think it's starting to evolve. I don't think it's going to go away. I think it is going to continue to grow. But a few years ago, all this boom was around Instagram, aspirational, being cool. That still is the case somewhat. But I think there's far more focus on the sustainability piece, about what it does for the planet, about looking at just reduction rather than complete emission. There's so many people now that started that lifestyle a year or two ago, and actually for whatever reason aren't following it anymore. And I think that flexitarian piece is quite big.
A lot more people are eating less meat rather than just cutting meat out altogether. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the trend that will just continue to grow and accelerate is gut health. I think we're only scratching the surface. There's real science coming out now around what goes in the microbiome, how important it is to so many factors of your well-being, and people being able to test their microbiome and so on. I think we're going to see more and more in that, because it's also becoming more and more important just in terms of how many people suffer with gut health and so on. So, right.
Time to wrap up, I think.
Time to wrap up. I hope that we didn't go too fast. Hopefully the recording will help fill in any bits that we sort of breezed through. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
It was a real pleasure. Please do support the podcast if you can. We'll make sure that you're the first people that hear about it, get the opportunity to listen to it first, and would really welcome any feedback. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah.
Hope to speak again soon.
Yeah. Cheers.